In the dim fog of Victorian England, where gas lamps flickered like desperate souls trapped in eternal twilight, a horror lurked beneath the cobblestones and manicured cemeteries, the unspeakable terror of being buried alive. This was an era when death's shadow was never far, when the line between life and death blurred in ways that could shatter the mind and haunt the soul forever. To be prematurely declared dead was a fate worse than any execution, a living nightmare that swallowed cries and hope beneath cold earth, deep within the silent tomb, and reports of those who had been mistakenly consigned to graves while still clinging to life. Medical science of the time, primitive and often flawed, struggled to distinguish between death and deep coma, leaving many vulnerable to this ultimate There were tallies told in hushed tones by gravediggers, who sometimes found scratch marks inside coffins or heard faint moans during the silent hours before dawn. Families lived in terror of the death's grasp, the cruel mistake that could transform the eternal rest into a living prison. To be buried alive was a cruel paradox. Death's door slammed shut, while life still clung desperately on the other side. In an age before modern diagnostics, faint pulses and shallow breaths could be missed, muffled by weak hearts and feeble lungs, where the fear of being buried alive permeated the collective consciousness and shaped the morbid rituals of an age desperate to keep death at bay. The story of Eleanor Whitmore is but a single thread in the chilling tapestry of Victorian premature burials, a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest horror is not death itself, but the suffocating silence of being forgotten alive beneath the earth. Safety coffins emerged, macabre contraptions equipped with bells, flags, or tubes to allow the buried a chance to signal the living above. These inventions were the desperate hope of a society wrestling with the fragility of life and the dread of being trapped beneath the earth, alone and unheard. Eleanor's body, weakened by her ordeal, never fully recovered. The psychological scars ran deeper, a soul forever haunted by the terror of a life overshadowed by the brush with the living death. Her story became a grim testament to the perils of Victorian medicine and the fragile boundary between life and oblivion. Yet, even these devices offered little solace to those whose final moments were spent in utter darkness, in suffocating silence. The grave was an unforgiving judge, final and merciless. But on the third night, a distant scratching sound at the gravesite jolted the night watchman awake. Torches flared, and gravediggers rushed to Eleanor's burial place, unearthed the coffin, and to their horror, found her alive but barely breathing, her fingers bloody and raw from the desperate struggle to escape death's premature grip. Meet Eleanor Whitmore, a woman of fragile health and even more fragile hope. Diagnosed with a mysterious wasting illness, she lay pale and motionless in her family's chamber, her breath shallow and heart slow. Her loved ones, bound by superstition and medical ignorance, watched in fearful silence as she teetered on the edge of life and death. The doctor pronounced her gone, dead, cold, and lifeless, and preparations for burial began with grim efficiency. But Eleanor's story would not end in the cold embrace of death. It was just beginning a new chapter written in terror. Victorian society was gripped by a profound fear of premature burial, a dread fed by countless tales. Eleanor's coffin was lowered into the cold earth, as mourners wept and prayers filled the chilled air. Yet, beneath the soil, something miraculous and horrifying unfolded. Her eyes flickered open in the darkness. Panic surged as the suffocating weight of soil pressed down upon her chest. The once still breath became a desperate gasp. Her hands clawed at the wooden lid, nails splintering against the coarse grain, but the silence above was unbroken. No one heard her silent screams trapped beneath the grave's cold vault. Stories like Eleanor's were not rare whispers but common truths lurking in the shadows of Victorian cemeteries. Fear gave rise to morbid innovations. Eleanor's family, unaware of her torment, prepared for a life without her, her chair left empty, her favorite belongings untouched. This harrowing rescue was both a blessing and a curse. As night falls on this tale, we must peer deeper into the darkness, where such tragedies multiplied. The nightmare of premature burial did not end with Eleanor Whitmore's agonizing escape. It was a shadow cast over an entire era, a haunting specter that gripped Victorian England with paralyzing fear and propelled society into a desperate scramble for protection against death's cruelest trick. The medical community, burdened by ignorance and limited technology, often condemned the living to eternal darkness, mistaking faint pulses for the final cessation of life. Families began to demand safeguards, leading to the invention of the safety coffin. These coffins were equipped with mechanisms designed to save the accidentally buried bells tied to strings, air tubes, flags to signal above ground to grant the trapped a faint hope of rescue. The trauma was compounded by societal disbelief. How does one prove the horror of being buried alive when death was presumed absolute? Death was not always immediate or obvious. It was a slow, creeping shadow, leaving bodies seemingly lifeless, yet still clinging to fragile life. The lack of advanced medical instruments meant that the line between coma, catalepsy, and death was dangerously blurred. Physicians relied on rudimentary methods, feeling pulses, checking breath, or applying irritanol, often insufficient to confirm death. They faced suspicion, and sometimes isolation, their sanity questioned by those who could not fathom such nightmares. Yet, even with these innovations, many perished silently, their screams muffled by darkness and soil. Premature burial was not just a physical nightmare but a metaphysical terror, the notion of being trapped between worlds, neither living nor dead, condemned to endless darkness. Though technology has advanced and death can now be measured with precision instruments, the Victorian fear of premature burial remains a haunting chapter in the history of medicine and mortality. Dark mirror reflecting humanity's eternal struggle against the unknown. This fear permeated funerary customs, influencing coffin designs, burial practices, and even the locations of cemeteries. This grim reality was etched into the bones of countless victims, souls who endured the unthinkable silence of the grave while still alive. Waykeeping, the vigil held over the deceased before burial, became a critical practice designed to catch any signs of life. Yet even these precautions failed to prevent tragedy. Reports abounded of coffins exhumed days or weeks after burial, only to find bodies with scratch marks inside the lid, or even fresh graves, disturbed by clawed earth-silent screams from those imprisoned in their own tombs. One such victim was Jonathan Hargrave, a farmer from a small hamlet on the outskirts of London, ill with a fever that left him pale and unresponsive. Jonathan was pronounced dead by the local physician after a cursory examination. His family, gripped by grief and trusting in the doctor's word, arranged a simple burial. Tales of the living dead, those entombed and awakened, permeated Gothic novels and eerie folklore, fanning the flames of collective terror. Edgar Allan Poe's macabre stories, for instance, echoed the very real fears of the time, blurring the lines between fiction and the grim truths haunting Victorian society. But as the gravediggers shoveled earth onto the coffin, a muffled thump shattered the stillness. Panic erupted as frantic clawing and desperate banging echoed from beneath the soil. The earth was torn open to reveal Jonathan, barely alive, gasping for breath in a nightmare he could not have imagined. Stories like Jonathan's were not isolated incidents, but a terrifying pattern that sowed distrust in the very instruments of life and death. The cultural obsession with premature burial extended beyond technology into literature and folklore, shaping public consciousness. The psychological torment of those who survived was profound. Survivors like Eleanor and Jonathan emerged with shattered nerves, haunted by claustrophobic memories of burial and suffocation. For many, the terror of premature burial was intertwined with the erst precarious understanding of death itself. Moreover, the social rituals surrounding death reflected this uncertainty. As Victorian society grappled with these horrors, it also wrestled with the fear of what lay beyond death. The legacy of these tragedies echoes into modern times, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the limits of human knowledge. In the grim shadows of Victorian cemeteries, where the soil was thick with secrets and sorrow, the line between life and death was perilously thin. The countless tales of premature burial were not just warnings whispered among mourners, they were lived horrors, etched into the very fabric of society. The local doctor, overwhelmed and untrained in distinguishing deep comas from death, declared her dead after a brief examination. The news devastated her family, but Victorian customs demanded swift burial to avoid the spread of disease. They found Margaret alive, but on the brink of death from starvation and trauma. The villagers' faces paled at the sight of her torn nails and hollow eyes. A living ghost returned from the brink. Families lingered longer at wakes, sometimes hiring watchmen to guard the recently deceased. The inability to accurately detect death was a glaring blind spot, a cruel flaw that doomed many to early graves. The Victorian preoccupation with death's mysteries birthed a Gothic culture steeped in macabre art, literature, and superstition. Poets and authors transformed real horrors into haunting stories, reflecting collective anxieties. The boundary between life and death became a foggy liminal space where terror and fascination intertwined. The era's doctors operated with rudimentary methods: pulse checks, breath observations, eyelid reflexes that failed to capture the nuances of conditions like catalepsy or comas induced by illness or injury. Her ordeal left an indelible mark on the village's collective memory, visceral reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows of death's domain. As we peer back into this dark chapter, we are confronted not only with the horror of being buried alive, but also with the fragile, tenuous nature of life itself, precariously balanced on the knife's edge between existence and oblivion. Churches offered waiting mortuaries, places where bodies were held under observation to ensure death's finality. Yet, despite these measures, tragedies persisted, fueling a macabre cycle of fear and loss. But Margaret's rescue was bittersweet. Her body had weakened, and her mind bore scars from the terrifying ordeal. A haunted soul forever altered by the brush with living death. Her coffin was sealed, and the funeral held under a veil of mourning and dread. Among these chilling stories stands the tragic figure of Margaret Finch, a young woman whose fate would become one of the darkest reminders of the era's medical failures and superstitions. Margaret was a spirited girl, vibrant with life and dreams, until a sudden illness left her frail and unresponsive. Yet, beneath the earth's cold grasp, Margaret awoke to a nightmare beyond imagining. Victorian inventors and entrepreneurs exploited public fear, creating safety coffins equipped with intricate signaling devices, bells to ring from below, flags to wave through tubes, air pipes for breathing. These mechanical saviors promised a slim chance of escape, but were imperfect and often too late. Trapped in utter darkness, surrounded by unforgiving wood and crushing soil, her first sensation was panic, the suffocating pressure, the inability to move or breathe freely. Her frantic movements inside the coffin left marks on the wood, desperate signals of life unseen by the grieving world above. But the cruel silence above swallowed her cries, and the cold earth pressed on without mercy. Her ordeal did not remain a secret. Weeks later, gravediggers exhumed her grave. After villagers reported eerie noises in the night, the phenomenon of premature burial was not merely a medical tragedy. It was a cultural obsession that birthed superstition, paranoia, and morbid ingenuity. Even in death rituals, the dread of premature burial reshaped practices. Medical science, meanwhile, struggled in the shadows of ignorance and limited tools. Society's response was a blend of dread and denial, a desperate grasp at control over the uncontrollable. Margaret Finch's story, like so many others, embodies the tragic collision of human frailty, medical uncertainty, and cultural fear. The final echoes of Victorian premature burials resonate not just in the tales of survivors, but in the grim reality of those who were never heard again. The earth, cold and indifferent, swallowed countless souls whose lives were stolen by ignorance and fear. Medical misdiagnosis, societal haste, and superstition formed a fatal triad, sealing fates before life's true end was known. Coffins became symbols of both finality and hope. Finality for the presumed dead, hope for those who feared premature entombment. Many lived in silence, haunted by memories no one else could understand, struggling to reintegrate into a world that had already written them off as dead. Their lives, truncated or forever altered, revealed the tragic human cost of an age struggling to comprehend death's mysteries. Yet, the Victorian panic remains a haunting reminder of the fragile thread upon which life hangs and the profound terror of being silenced beneath the earth's cold embrace. Their cries muffled, their struggles unseen, they lie beneath the soil as a testament to a past where the boundary between life and death was blurred and treacherous. The Victorian era's dance with premature burial serves as a solemn warning that sometimes the greatest horror is not death itself, but the suffocating silence of being forgotten alive. It is a chilling legacy, a dark mirror reflecting our ancestors' fears and the eternal human battle against the unknown. Through their stories, we glimpse the stark reality of Victorian England, a world where science and superstition collided, where the fear of death was as potent as death itself. Their lives became silent testaments to human resilience and the fragility of the boundaries separating existence from oblivion. the safety coffin industry flourished, offering mechanical bells, breathing tubes, and signaling devices as a bulwark against the horror of being forgotten alive. Yet, despite these innovations, the darkness claimed many, sealing their fate beneath the unyielding soil. Families, desperate to protect their loved ones from illness or scandal, often rushed to bury them swiftly, fearing contagion and decay. The waiting mortuaries, places designed to hold bodies for observation, were insufficient against the pressing demands of an unforgiving society. In the quiet corners of England's cemeteries, beneath layers of soil and stone, lie uncounted victims trapped between life and death, their stories lost to time but forever etched in history's darkest corners. One of the most haunting aspects of this grim chapter is the tragic inevitability woven into every case. The Victorian obsession with death and the afterlife cast long shadows over burial practices. Psychological trauma of survivors was profound and often lifelong. The terror of being trapped underground, alone and helpless, left deep scars. Eleanor Whitmore, Jonathan Hargrave, Margaret Finch, names that echo across time, representing the countless forgotten souls caught in this nightmare. Today, advances in medicine and technology have rendered premature burial nearly impossible. As we close this chapter, we must remember the faces lost to this silent horror.